They stripped him of his duty for one reason. He moved when he wasn't supposed to. No scandal, no fight, no shouted command. Just a single moment in the Queen's private corridor when Lance Sergeant Edward Harrow tilted his head because he swore he heard footsteps. Footsteps no one else reported. Footsteps no camera recorded. And yet, Harrow's instincts told him he wasn't wrong. Before I show you what happened inside Windsor Castle that night, and how a single sound ended the career of a royal guard, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because this wasn't a mistake. This was a guard punished not for failing his duty, but for refusing to ignore what he heard in the silence. Windsor Castle after nightfall is not empty. It only feels that way. The tourists are long gone, their voices swallowed by cobblestones and iron gates hours earlier. The musicians who had filled the afternoon air with brass and drum have packed away their instruments. Even the chatter of staff has receded to distant kitchens and service corridors. What remains is silence, a silence so complete it presses against the ears like weight. Lance Sergeant Edward Harrow stood in that silence, a single figure posted along the Queen's private corridor. His boots rested square on ancient stone, polished by centuries of duty. His scarlet tunic looked almost black beneath the low electric sconces, his bearskin cap rising into shadow. The SA-80 rifle rested where it should, angled against his shoulder with parade-ground precision. From a distance, he looked like every other royal guard, still, statuesque, the embodiment of tradition. But Harrow's stillness wasn't emptiness. Behind his eyes, alertness hummed like a live wire. He had learned that habit in places far from Windsor. Helmand Province had taught him that a soldier could never let silence mean safety. Quiet could be a gift, but more often it was a trap. He had spent years training his ears to catch the difference between wind-rattling corrugated tin and a hand-brushing cloth, between a goat stumbling over rubble and a man pacing in the dark. Those lessons had followed him home, whether the army wanted them here or not. The Queen's corridor was long and narrow, lined with portraits that seemed to watch him as the minutes ticked by. A polished brass handle gleamed at the chamber door to his left. Further down the passage, another guard stood rigid, half hidden in shadow. Beyond them, the castle stretched outward into courtyards, guard rooms, and stone stairwells that snaked into places visitors would never see. The air smelled faintly of old oak polish and the cooling stone of the walls. Somewhere far below, a clock bell chimed the quarter hour. Harrow measured his breathing with the same precision he always did. One slow inhale, one slow exhale, every 8 seconds, so steady it almost matched the rhythm of the clock itself. Nothing moved, nothing spoke. And yet, even in stillness, Harrow felt the atmosphere tighten. It wasn't dramatic, no bang, no obvious breach, nothing a bystander would notice. But a soldier who had lived through ambushes could sense when quiet shifted from peaceful to watchful. Harrow's skin prickled beneath the collar of his tunic. The portraits on the wall seemed to lean closer, as though waiting. He told himself it was just another night shift, just another uneventful posting in a fortress built for ceremonies, not combat. But deep down, Edward Harrow knew something was off. He couldn't name it yet, couldn't point to proof. All he had was instinct, and instinct, in his experience, was rarely wrong. It was 23:40 when the sound began. At first it was faint enough to dismiss, the kind of noise that could belong to settling stone or a draft pulling across old hinges. But Harrow's ears caught it immediately, because it carried rhythm. Not random creaks, not the stumble of a shifting beam. These were measured, steady, the pattern of footsteps. He kept his body rigid, face forward, but inside his chest every instinct sharpened. Boots on stone, yes, but lighter than the weight of a guard in full kit. These steps were cautious, careful, as though whoever owned them was trying not to be heard. That effort itself gave them away. The corridor was supposed to be sealed. Past this hour, movement near the Queen's chambers followed a strict rotation, guards at set intervals, protection officers on fixed patrol. Staff cleared well before midnight. No one simply walked these halls unannounced. Harrow's eyes stayed fixed ahead, but his mind mapped the sound. It began near the far end of the gallery, close to an archway where portraits of former monarchs glared down through centuries of varnish. 4 steps, a pause, 2 more, another pause, then silence so complete it rang in his ears. He slowed his breathing even further, 8 seconds stretching to 10, so the inhale would not drown what might come next. He remembered Helmond, crouched behind a mud wall while footsteps scraped along the other side. Out there, failure to distinguish animal from man had cost soldiers their lives. Here it would cost him his honour, but the stakes felt no less sharp. Again the sound came, this time closer. The cadence suggested a single person. The distribution of weight, quick off the heel, light on the toe, told him something else, and someone trained, or at least practiced, at moving quietly. The hair prickled on the back of his neck. Whoever was there wasn't a drunken staffer wandering off route. He wanted, every fibre of him wanted, to turn his head, to search the shadows with his eyes. But protocol held him still. The duty of a ceremonial guard was absolute. Remain fixed, remain silent, remain unyielding. To break posture without cause was to undermine centuries of tradition. Yet every soldier's instinct in him screamed the opposite. Somewhere in the darkened corridor the steps stopped again. It wasn't retreat. It wasn't advance. It was as though the unseen presence had become aware of being detected and chose stillness instead. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. It pressed into Harrow's skull like a weight. Was it real? Was it memory, nerves, imagination? He had seen too much to dismiss it as nothing. He knew the difference between echoes in his head and the scrape of a real boot's sole across ancient stone. The Queen's chamber door gleamed at his left. His rifle remained angled, his boots rooted. But beneath the unyielding surface of a royal guard's stillness, Lance Sergeant Edward Harrow was certain. Someone had been walking where no one should. And now that someone was waiting. Harrow's training had been clear. The first enemy to beat is yourself. Fear makes a man see ghosts where there are none. Tension convinces him shadows move. And in the ceremonial world of Windsor, where stillness was the measure of discipline, a guard who twitched at nothing was worse than useless. He told himself this as the silence stretched. He told himself again as the ache built in his shoulders. You imagined it. It was nothing. But the conviction would not stick. The sound of those measured steps still pulsed through his skull, undeniable as heartbeat. He tried to trace it logically. Patrol schedule, unchanged. No relief due until midnight. Protection officers had their routes, all of them documented, all of them far from this private corridor. Even the cleaners had finished hours ago. This was the most restricted quarter of the castle, the one place footsteps shouldn't echo without warning. Harrow's mind turned back to Helmond. He remembered one night outside Sangin, when a comrade dismissed the scuff of movement as a goat in the fields. It wasn't. Minutes later, the outpost was hit from 3 angles. Harrow survived. His friend did not. Since that day, he'd sworn never to ignore the small thing. Small things killed. But here the rules bound tighter. His duty was to stand unbroken, a pillar of tradition visible to none but essential to all. To step out, to break formation, to chase a sound, that would mark him forever as unfit for ceremonial trust. Guards were statues, not hunters. The corridor mocked him with its stillness. The portraits, long dead kings and queens, seemed to glare as if testing him. Will you hold, or will you falter? At the far end, the other sentry remained perfectly motionless, unaware. Harrow's sense of isolation deepened. Whatever had passed through that arch, he alone had heard it. If he spoke, would they believe him? Or would they see only weakness, proof he was jumpy, unreliable, still haunted by battlefields? His chest tightened. He could almost feel the accusation waiting in some unseen future meeting. Why did you move, Sergeant? Why did you break stillness? He forced himself back into the rhythm of ceremonial breath, slow, steady, precise. He let the seconds drip past, each one stretched like wire. And yet the awareness never faded. It hovered behind him like a shadow out of place, like breath on the nape of his neck. He knew with a soldier's certainty something had walked here tonight, something that should not have. And though no one else had noticed, Edward Harrow had. It was a lonely kind of knowledge, the kind that isolates a man even as it hardens him. He would not yield, not to fear, not to doubt, not to the silence pressing in from all sides. Whatever he had heard, he would hold the line. The silence pressed so thick it felt alive. Harrow's chest rose and fell in deliberate cadence, his breath a metronome against the tension gnawing at his mind. He repeated the creed drilled into every guard, unseen, unheard, unbroken. Stillness was not just posture, it was principle. To move without sanction was to crack the illusion that held the monarchy's dignity aloft. But instincts are not so easily silenced. Every nerve in his body remembered those Afghan nights when survival depended on trusting the small things, dust displaced in moonlight, a boot scuff on gravel, a held breath in the dark. Protocol had its weight, yes, but so did lived memory, and his memory screamed at him now. He could feel sweat prickling beneath the heavy bearskin, though the corridor was cool. His eyes fixed forward, yet the muscles in his neck begged him to turn, to scan the shadowed arch where the sound had last come from. He fought the impulse. 1 inch of movement could be observed, reported, noted against his record. He imagined the entry, written coldly in some aide's logbook. Guard shifted posture without cause. That single line would undo years of service, stain his regiment, cast doubt upon his steadiness. And yet, what if he ignored it? What if the sound signalled more than imagination, a trespasser, a breach, a threat so close to the Queen's chamber? Would inaction then mark him a coward, too bound by appearance to protect what mattered? Protocol versus instinct. Honour versus vigilance. His heart beat harder, though he kept his stance impeccable. In a decision so small it might not even register to an onlooker, he allowed himself one subtle deviation. The tilt of his head, a fraction of an inch, enough to widen the corridor in his peripheral vision, enough to satisfy the soldier in him that he had not simply frozen. His eyes flicked across stone, arch and shadow. Nothing moved, nothing changed, but he felt it as certain as the rifle against his palm, that the corridor was not empty. The quiet stretched into punishment. A guard's role was not to explain, not to question, not even to understand. It was to embody tradition so thoroughly that even doubt could not bend it. And yet, standing there, Harrow could no longer pretend stillness was enough. He was a soldier first, a ceremonial figure second. He knew the difference between silence as peace and silence as concealment. And tonight, his instincts told him this silence was the latter. The sound had vanished. The corridor returned to its ordinary silence, lamplight on stone, portraits staring, the faint smell of wax polish in the air. To anyone else, nothing had happened, but Harrow knew better. His fraction of a movement had been his compromise, a soldier's instinct fighting to survive inside a cage of tradition. He thought no one had noticed. He was wrong. At 23:50, the hush broke with the muffled creak of a service door. A palace aide emerged from a side passage, holding a leather folder of documents pressed tight against his chest. Thin, balding, dressed in dark suit and spectacles, he walked briskly down the corridor, clearly heading for a clerk's office further along. His shoes clicked softly against the flagstones. As he passed, his eyes flicked up, habit more than intention, and landed on Harrow. The aide slowed for a heartbeat. He had seen it. The slight tilt of the guard's head, the unnatural tension in his jaw. Guards were meant to be statues. They weren't meant to move, to shift, to betray vigilance. To someone steeped in ceremony, even the smallest deviation stood out like a crack in glass. The aide's expression barely changed, a flicker of curiosity, maybe irritation, then gone. He resumed his pace, shoes clicking into distance, but Harrow felt the weight of it all the same. He had been observed. And in a palace, being observed meant being reported. By morning the chain had already begun. A quiet note passed along in measured, bureaucratic tones. Sentry outside chamber appeared unsettled during night post. Broke posture without cause. No mention of footsteps. No allowance for instinct. just a cold assessment that one of the guards had shown weakness in the most sacred of postings. The words moved faster than he did, from aide to clerk, from clerk to steward, from steward to officer. By the time Harrow stepped off duty, weary-eyed and still convinced he had heard what he had heard, the judgment was already forming in halls far beyond his reach. To his fellow guards, nothing seemed different. They nodded to him as he returned to the guardroom, another shift completed. But beneath the surface, the machinery of tradition had already begun grinding forward, and Harrow was caught in its gears. He would learn soon enough that the quiet sound of footsteps was not the only thing following him that night. Morning came with its usual ritual, boots polished, tunic pressed, rifle checked with ceremonial care. Harrow moved through the motions as he always did, yet the weight of the night still clung to him. He could not shake the rhythm of those footsteps, nor the certainty that something had been there in the dark. But when the summons arrived, clipped and formal, he knew instinctively it had nothing to do with the footsteps. A young corporal delivered the message without ceremony. "Report to the adjutant's office, immediately." His tone was neutral, but the look in his eyes said more. Everyone in the regiment knew what such a summons meant. Harrow followed the long corridors of Wellington Barracks, his boots echoing faintly against the polished floors. Inside the office, he found 3 men waiting. Captain Denholm, his immediate superior, a civilian aide in a slate-grey suit, and another officer, whose role was less clear, but whose presence lent weight. The room smelled faintly of ink and old paper. Files were stacked neatly along the desk, one folder already opened. Harrow's name was typed neatly on the cover. "Lance Sergeant Harrow," Captain Denholm began, voice clipped and cool. "You were observed last night departing from expected conduct during ceremonial duty." Harrow stood at parade rest, eyes fixed forward. "Sir, I maintained my post." The civilian aide adjusted his glasses. "That is not what was reported. You were seen shifting posture, showing agitation. Guards are to remain statuesque at all times. That standard was not upheld." Harrow's jaw tightened. He forced his reply calm. "With respect, sir, I heard movement in the corridor, footsteps, not on the rotation schedule. It was my duty to remain alert." A silence fell. Denham's brow furrowed slightly, but the other officer leaned forward, his tone sharper. "There was no movement logged in that. No authorized personnel, no incident reports. Cameras flagged nothing unusual. Do you understand what that means, Sergeant?" Harrow's answer came steady. "It means the cameras missed it, sir, but I didn't." The civilian aide's mouth twitched in something between irritation and dismissal. "So, we are to believe that in a sealed royal corridor, under full security watch, you alone heard what no other man or system detected?" "Yes, sir," Harrow replied without hesitation. "Because it was there." The officers exchanged glances. The weight of tradition and protocol pressed down heavier than the truth of one soldier's senses. Denham spoke again, softer but with finality. "The ceremonial guard exists to embody composure. To falter is to undermine that image. You may have believed you heard something, but belief is not enough. Our duty is not only to protect, but to preserve trust. And last night, Sergeant, you failed in that duty." The words landed with the dull impact of a gavel. Harrow said nothing. He stood straight, bearing the judgment without protest, though inside him burned the knowledge that he had done nothing wrong. He had listened, he had noticed, he had trusted his training, and for that he was being condemned. The meeting ended without drama. No raised voices, no heated exchanges, just the quiet machinery of institution grinding forward, reducing a man's vigilance to a line in a report. As Harrow left the office, the corridors felt colder than before. The castle stone seemed less like history and more like a wall closing in. He had not been punished yet, but the verdict was already written. The notice came 2 days later. It wasn't a grand ceremony or a dramatic dismissal. No officers assembled to read it aloud, no parade ground reprimand. Just a single sheet of paper, folded once and left on his bunk, the way bad news often arrives in the military, quietly, almost politely, as if the softness of delivery might blunt the edge of consequence. Effective immediately, Lance Sergeant Edward Harrow is relieved of ceremonial guard duty. pending reassignment to administrative support within regimental operations. That was all. No elaboration, no acknowledgement of service, no room for appeal. Harrow read it twice, then a third time, the words pressing deeper each time. Relieved. A single word that carried the weight of disgrace. In the army, a soldier might survive wounds, losses, even failure in battle. But to be relieved of duty was something else entirely. It suggested that trust had evaporated, that his presence was no longer an asset, but a liability. Around him, the barracks carried on with its usual rhythm. Boots clattered in the corridor. Laughter echoed from a nearby mess room. Guards prepared uniforms for the next ceremony, chatting idly about tourists, about weather, about anything but him. Word spread anyway. In a regiment, nothing stayed quiet. Men did not ask him directly, but glances lingered. A subtle distance grew. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with the suspicion reserved for those who had broken invisible rules. Harrow did not defend himself. What could he say? That he had heard footsteps in a sealed corridor? That silence had betrayed him? To insist on it would only deepen the impression that he had lost composure, so he bore it. He stood at attention during roll call, his name answered without pride. He polished boots he would not wear on parade. He cleaned a rifle that would not rest against his shoulder in Windsor's corridors again. What stung was not the loss of position, nor even the whispers. It was the knowledge that he had not faltered, that his instincts had been sharp, his attention true, and for that he had been punished. In Helmond, noticing the small things had saved his life. In Windsor, it had stripped him of honour. He folded the paper once more and tucked it inside his journal. No protest, no plea. Just a line in his own hand beneath it. I was right to listen, even if no one else will ever know. That night, he sat alone in the barracks, staring at the walls that seemed closer than before. Ceremony would go on without him, flawless and unbroken. To the public, nothing had changed, but for Harrow, everything had. He was no longer a guard. He was a man with a memory of footsteps in the dark, and the knowledge that silence could end a career as surely as gunfire had ended lives overseas. The barracks were quiet by the time Harrow returned to his bunk. Most of the men were asleep. Boots lined neatly beneath bed, scarlet tunics hung in rows like dormant flames waiting for dawn. The stillness felt different here, softer, almost forgiving. Yet for Harrow, it was heavy with a new kind of weight. He sat alone, the folded paper still in his hand. The decision was final. Stripped of ceremonial guard duty, reassigned to tasks that carried no rifle, no platform, no dignity. In a single line of text, years of discipline had been reduced to clerical work. He placed the paper beside his journal and opened the worn notebook. Its pages carried fragments of years past, brief notes from deployments, reflections written in cramped handwriting during long nights. Tonight, he added one more line. I heard footsteps. I was punished for listening. The act of writing steadied him, but it did not soothe. His mind returned again and again to the moment in the corridor, the rhythm of steps, the deliberate pauses, the silence that followed as though someone had realized they were being overheard. He replayed it in his head with painful clarity, each detail sharper than the last. Had he imagined it? He asked himself the question because he had to, not because he believed it. Too many times in Afghanistan, he had relied on the same instincts, and they had kept him alive. The cadence of those unseen steps had been no dream. It had been real, and yet reality mattered less than appearances. Tradition demanded a statue, not a sentinel. Composure mattered more than vigilance. And for breaking that illusion, he had been cast out. He leaned forward on the bunk, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. A dull ache crept into his chest, the kind of ache that came not from fear or anger, but from loss. He did not rage. He did not curse the officers who had dismissed him, or the aide who had watched and reported. Instead, he sat quietly, holding himself with the same discipline he had shown in the corridor. But inside, a line had been drawn. He understood now that the institution he served valued silence more than truth, posture more than perception. And yet, even knowing what it had cost him, he could not bring himself to regret listening. For he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Footsteps had echoed where none should have. And he had heard them. Long after the others had drifted into steady breathing and the barracks lay in darkness, Harrow remained awake. His hand brushed the cover of his journal. He whispered to himself, not a prayer, not a vow, but a simple statement of fact. I would rather lose my post for noticing than stand blind for tradition. The words lingered in the silence, faint but unshakable. And though stripped of duty, Edward Harrow felt the smallest measure of peace. The following week, Windsor resumed its rhythm. The courtyards filled again with tourists clutching maps and phones. Eyes wide as scarlet tunics and bearskin caps appeared beneath the September sun. Brass rang from the band's instruments, echoing across centuries-old stone. Children squealed as guards marched with mechanical precision, rifles angled, boots slamming in unison. To the world watching, nothing had changed. The line of Coldstream guards stood flawless outside the Queen's chambers, each man a figure carved from tradition. The discipline of centuries lived in their stillness, their silence, their unbroken bearing. Tourists whispered with awe, unaware of what had unfolded in those same corridors only nights before. In Harrow's place stood another soldier, young, fresh-faced, posture impeccable. His rifle gleamed. His gaze fixed forward, he embodied exactly what the public expected, the immovable guardian of royal dignity. No one in the crowd knew who he had replaced. No one asked. The institution endured, as it always had. From a distance, Harrow watched once more, standing among civilians at the edge of the barrier. His uniform was gone. Plain clothes marked him as just another figure in the crowd. He blended easily, anonymous in the press of onlookers. But as the band struck a familiar march and the formation shifted with flawless precision, his eyes found the door, the same brass handle, the same portraits glowering from within, the same stretch of stone where his instincts had betrayed him to silence. For a moment he let himself imagine he heard them again, the careful tread, the measured pause, the sound that no one else had admitted. His chest tightened, not with doubt, but with memory. Perhaps it had been nothing. Perhaps some aide had strayed. Some patrol had mislogged their time. Some echo had played tricks. Or perhaps not. Perhaps footsteps had truly walked where they should not. The truth was sealed in silence, and the castle would never confess. The ceremony rolled on. Tourists applauded as if witnessing history, unaware that history's truest moments often passed unnoticed in the quiet. Harrow did not cheer. He did not speak. He simply turned away when the crowd began to disperse, slipping into the flow of visitors, leaving through the south gate. For Windsor, nothing had happened. The machine of tradition had smoothed over every crack. But for Harrow, everything had changed. He knew what he had heard, and he knew that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world was not being wrong, but being right too soon. What would you have done if you were in Lance Sergeant Harrow's place that night? Trust your instincts, or hold still for the sake of tradition. And do you believe he was right to move, even slightly, when protocol demanded absolute stillness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you don't miss tomorrow's story. And if you know someone who values quiet courage, share this video with them. Other stories are on your screen now. Click one and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, with a brand new story.